I'm supposed to introduce Marty, but to be honest, he doesn't need to be introduced. And you all were in church, so you all read what he's going to talk about. So take it away, Marty.
All right, thanks. Okay. Yeah, this is an interesting task for me in these 2 weeks to cover 2,000 years of Christian history and leave time to talk about the next 200 years. And I told Malin when he got in here early, it just reminded me a little bit, if not that I've ever done this, but it's like a speed dating thing. You know, I'm going to be zipping through. Each 100 years gets about 30 seconds. So bear with me on that. But I do want to say when we begin, I just trust that you, through this all, you will continue to recognize that you are, each and every one of you, beloved children of God. And we also have the challenge that comes with that to fully live into that. And so the people, the history I'm going to cover is about people just like us, good and bad, but seeking to live out their faith in how they understood it to be. Now, history in and of itself is not a totally accurate accounting of what has gone on over time. History is best understood as what we choose to remember about the past. And there is good historical writing that goes on. It changes over time. As I was preparing this, I thought about the time I was finishing my history degree, the movement towards what was called her story, her instead of his story for history, was beginning. And that was a very legitimate attempt to expand the role of women in history, because many voices are left out as we write history. And the current project called the 1619 Project is a legitimate and rightful exercise in bringing to our attention the history of African Americans in this country who first came here in 1619. Are things that he understood to be unclean, things that were not allowed in the Jewish faith. And this is a revelation to Peter. And it's often the way that our faith can be changed. We will have an aha experience. It's not even rational necessarily. And Peter sees that he needs to change his understanding of these things and be more tolerant of people in general and what is expected. And that model of this thing descending is something that will happen throughout the history of Christianity. There are times when there are new unveilings. There are times when we realize, oh, women can preach. People of different genders can be allowed. These sorts of new awakenings happen throughout our Christian history. The Gentiles who would follow this, some of them had been involved with the traditional Jewish faith. We know them by the label God-fearers, being people who had adopted the Jewish faith but were not of Jewish birth. And those would become more common as this first century goes on. Now, Paul, who was a devout Jew, and if you've read his letters and the book of Acts, Paul would be called a very strong type A personality. He is driven He also has had a vision on the road to Damascus, and it's fundamentally changed the way he views the world around him. He had been, by self-description, essentially in the police force of the temple, persecuting the sect that followed Jesus. He was the most devout of devout. He'd grown up in the city of Tarsus, which is on the southeast coast of Turkey. And in his teen years, went to Jerusalem, studied under Gamaliel, who was one of the best known teachers of the Jewish faith. So his credentials were quite high in terms of his Jewish faith. And yet he goes out early and preaches to the larger world around Israel. We read about his journeys to Turkey and Greece. Typically, he would go first to the synagogue to preach to Jews, to try to get them to become part of this new sect of religious people, which we now call Christian. When that would be met with resistance, he would go and preach to Gentiles. And he would begin to convert more and more people, would start what could best be called home churches in these various locations. And this was his calling 24/7. And even some of the people that he took with him on these who didn't measure up to what Paul wanted in terms of commitment, he would drop by the wayside. And yet through this all, Paul would be what I would call a mystic. His experiences and his descriptions of what God was desiring and what Jesus was teaching border on the mystical sense. He had a calling that I don't know that he could even fully explain. And when you read the beauty of some of his passages in his letters, describing people calling us to our best selves, calling us to love, calling us to put aside our own egos, he is speaking from a mystical sense. Paul is also the writer of the New Testament. His letters are written before the Gospels. And sometimes we forget that and we think, well, he must know the Gospels. Well, they aren't in existence yet. He's writing and defining.
It's an extremely difficult thing. The material to write on, usually papyrus, was a cumbersome process. And to write down, typically what they did was they wrote on a scroll that would be about 14 inches by 30 feet. And their writing in Hebrew at the time and in Greek also, there was no punctuation, no capitals. And I will say, first of all, these are approximations. No one knows exactly. It is generally accepted by scholars that of the Gospels, Mark was written first. And when Matthew and Luke's Gospels were written, they had a copy of Mark's Gospel to look at. Simply stands for the word 12, which means unknown. It's a source that we don't know who wrote it. And you will see that Matthew and Luke use that source when they're writing their Gospels. Okay, now I'm going to move on to the fire. Nero was mentioned this morning. We're now in Rome, the year 64 AD. There's a huge fire that sweeps through Rome, destroying much of the city. And when we talk about a city, what it's really destroying are what we would call shanty towns, very simple dwellings. And putting together whatever they could speak in. And this fire went through much of that and destroyed it. And Nero, wanting someone to blame, and he did not know the difference between Jews and Christians. He blamed them both. He just basically called them Jews in the writing of the time because they were an easy scapegoat. There's no reason to believe they started the fire, but they were the ones that were blamed for it. And tradition has it that Paul and Peter died in Rome, persecuted and dying in Rome. But we don't have any, from a historian's perspective, there's no clear evidence to that. And Peter's death, of course, would be claimed by the city of Rome later as the first, Peter would be the first pope. And, but we don't actually know what happened to them. There was a tax on both Jews and Romans, Jews and Christians in the city of Rome, just because of their status. And that was not removed until the year 96. And then it was only removed from Christians. Jews had to continue to pay. Meanwhile, back in Israel, one of the major tragedies for Hebrew Jewish faith is the destruction of the temple in the year 7. The Jews had always been obstreperous people. They had often risen up because of defending their faith and got themselves in quarrels. The Romans were very quick. That's why they had a larger army there than in some other territories. Very quick to put the rebellions down. But in 66, a large one started. And we've heard the story of the Jewish people of Masada and those sorts of things. That all happened and culminated in the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And at that point, the Romans drove all Jews out of the city and far away from the city. So when you hear things in the Gospel of Mark, flee to the hills, etc., Mark may well have been written during that time. And people were fleeing, and the Jews now no longer have their home. We know about the Babylonian exile and the destruction of the temple then, but they continue to believe that God resided in their temple, or at least was there for certain special Jewish religious activities. But with the destruction of the temple, where is God? And so the Jews are going to have to rebuild their faith following that experience. And they would move to synagogues. Rabbis would start to be often from the ranks of the Pharisees. They would be a decentralized faith from that point on. And the role of the disciples and followers of Jesus at the time of his death, that was, as we know, was a shock to his followers. They just did not expect that, even though Jesus had been teaching them that this would happen. And in the aftermath of that, they hold up for fear of their own lives, but something happened to turn them into people who were called to put their lives on the line and go and preach and try to create other followers of Jesus. One of the things they did was they looked at their Old Testament, or what we call the Jewish Old Testament, with new eyes. They read it carefully to see where it could help them understand this experience of this Jesus person and what had happened with him. And they began to re-understand the Old Testament in the light of that lived experience and what came out of that was a sense of urgency as his disciples and followers, and Jesus had many more followers than the 12 disciples, went out and spread this new faith throughout Israel, to the east, to North Africa, and through Paul, covering a lot of ground. I want to read a little piece here. This has to do with what would become the New Testament. It should already be clear that there was no single or singular human hand guiding and guarding the composition of the books of the New Testament. These books were written by various people at various times in various places to differing audiences, and their authors would no doubt be surprised to find such occasional documents as letters and homilies as part of a sacred canon of scripture we now call the New Testament. There were, after all, no real letter documents or sermon documents in the Hebrew scriptures, and we find no precedent for them. The documents we have explored in this chapter reveal living Christian communities that have leaders vitally concerned about the well-being of the converts to these congregations. It appears that all the authors of these documents were Jewish, and all reflect indebtedness to their Jewish heritage, though they draw on it in differing ways. James is just as Jewish document as Hebrews or 1 Peter, or all three address Jewish Christians, but oh, how very different these documents are. And that will lead us into what happens as Christianity begins to grow and expand. And there is no clear path for it to follow. One of the books that I've read is the author is Rodney Stark, and he's talking about why did Christianity grow as rapidly as it did. And he studied the historical record, and he talks about the fact that many people were moving into cities in the year 100 and the years 200, and they were coming from countrysides. They were leaving homes and places that were all they knew. That's where they lived, that's who loved them, who took care of them, coming to the city because they needed work. And the record shows that early Christians were the ones who first stepped forward to help these people when they were starving, who would take their bodies when they died,
them a service and bury them. Because when you're alone in a city and no one you know as family is there, there's no one to care for you. And these people were dying on the streets, and the Christians were going out and seeing to it that they had a burial, a service, and cared for them and any other people that were associated with them. And that led to a rapid expansion. That's Christianity in action. It isn't just the preaching, it's the actual living of the words of Jesus. It was spreading by this time into further west, into the Roman territory, into North Africa, into the Middle East. And the period between 100 and 300 is marked by the early church, what they call the patristic fathers. These are the early leaders of the church throughout these areas. By the year 150, there were 5 primary bishops within the Christian church. They were headquartered in Alexandria in Egypt, Antioch, Constantinople, Ephesus, and Rome. And each was a leader co-equal for deciding how this faith was going to live out. The earliest theologians, I would call them, were Irenaeus, Origen, John Chrysostom, Antiochus, and others. Other sources.
there were clashes over the Trinity in which thousands of Christians killed each other as they fought about what our faith was going to be about. And eventually, through this process, they would arrive at a pretty general idea of what books were to guide them as Christians, how they were to deal with the Old Testament, what were their standing, what was Orthodoxy for Christians. And there is the well-known joke about St. Augustine walking on the beach. He's in the 400s, and he comes across a boy with a pail and a little hand shovel digging sand by the ocean. And Augustine asks him, "What are you doing?" And he said, "Well, my plan is to empty the ocean." And then the boy asked Augustine, "What are you thinking about?" And he says, "I'm trying to figure out the Trinity." And the boy says, "I will have the ocean empty before we get and as all of this is going on, it's not that it was a bad thing to happen, it was a necessary thing to happen. And when you think about your own journey of faith, and you think about the faith you had as a child and a teenager and a young adult and where you're at now, do you not go through a process in which you're learning more, you're adding to your faith, your faith is changing somewhat in terms of what's important? It's the same process collectively, only magnified by many thousands. Ultimately, the Council of Nicaea is called. You probably know the story about the Roman Emperor Constantine and his conversion in the year 312 to the Christian faith. He wins a great battle and believes that he was favored in it because he was Christian leaning. His mother was an ardent Christian, but in any case, he legitimizes the Christian faith for the first time in the Roman Empire. And now it's become the faith of the empire, which will create new issues down the road that relate still to what Megan was preaching about this morning, about what's the relationship between our faith and those people who hold power. In 312, the church called together the leading bishops from Christianity. There were somewhere between 250 and 315 in attendance. They came from all over the areas we talked about. Most were from east of Rome, not many from the west. And they were called to resolve what was called the Aryan Controversy. And that had to do in part with whether the Old Testament should even be a part of the Christian faith, or whether it should be discarded. And the Trinitarian understandings was Jesus to be co-equal with the Father, God, or was his standing something less than that because of his human aspect? There was no preeminence given to the Roman bishop at this point in time. So we're in the year 312, and while Rome is saying they have popes, it's not recognized by much of the rest of Christianity at that point. It results in the Nicene Creed, which many of us learned as children and is repeated in churches now. That was refined in the year 371, but it was a foundational piece to Christian faith. They also had to set up the date for Easter. Easter was, depending on which part of the world your Christianity was in, was either set on a certain day that rotated amongst weeks, or it was always on a Sunday. So they resolved that. They started an ecumenical group to try and continue to sort out the difficulties that arose in the faith, and concluded, but from that point forward, we're going to be into more of an Orthodox nature to Christianity. Any questions at this point?
I have a question. Just what you said about Orthodox. So is that kind of like just having one tradition that's separate from Judaism, or what does that mean?
It's having a common set of understandings of what Christianity is, and henceforth having that determined by a person in authority, like the Pope, who will set the rules, so to speak.
Did the Nicene Creed come out of this, Marty?
The Nicene Creed came out of the council called by Constantine in the year 312. Yeah. And that's the first time that Christianity has a common statement as to the nature of God, Christ, and the Holy Spirit, and their relationship. And a little conclusion here that would apply to about this time, because they're also going to resolve which books will be in the New Testament in other councils that are coming up. There were many more books used by Christians than what we read of in the New Testament, but this will sort of answer that. The story of the New Testament is not the story of something done by a few for the many, nor is it a story about the Orthodox co-opting of the tradition in the 4th century for self-serving purposes, to the exclusion of the historical losers. It is the story of the impact of the Jesus movement on literate Christians who choose one way or another to write to various audiences about their faith. It is a story of courage and perseverance against great odds, and a story of faithfulness to the traditions already begun to be passed down by the very first Jewish Christians in Jerusalem, who prayed and sang praises to Christ, the divine and yet human Son of God, and who believed in the narrative when it said that he was crucified, dead and buried, and on the 3rd day ascended into heaven and is poised to come again. Through the toil of writing on papyrus and then codices, these texts were formed, copied, circulated, collected, and finally canonized. And canonized, as you know, means they are made the official writings of the church. So that whole story is a story of people of faith seeking to understand more fully what it is Jesus meant, what it is Jesus was calling for, and trying to put that together in a way that caused a common way to worship and grow as Christians. There's a lot of writing out there about the Gospels that didn't get into the Bible, or other books that did or didn't get into the Bible. But the fact is that what was arrived at by the councils, by the time of the councils, was already pretty much in practice in most Christian places around the Christian world. One of the downsides of Orthodoxy is that now you have heresy. Because once it's defined what a Christian is, if you do something another what that definition is, you're a heretic. And that will be with us for the next 1,500 years, as people seek new ways to, people understand Christianity in new ways, and it comes into conflict with what is Orthodox. And in fact, it's still a factor in our world today. And it's often used by politicians and the state to claim that Christianity says thus and so, because it aligns with their personal direction that they want to go. Following the council, the Western world goes into a period of called, for lack of a better term, the Dark Ages. And that will last for about 500 years. And that will affect faith. What happens is that organized government disappears, countrysides become much less controlled. There is, the roads aren't safe, books get burned, we lose much of the early writing because of this. We essentially descend into a more barbaric period as people. People are fearful. They don't, life is perilous from day to day. And there does not appear to be any better prospects on the immediate horizon. And what that's going to affect your faith. And you may have read a book like How the Irish Saved Civilization and Christianity. And what the book talks about is that because Ireland was so far removed from the Dark Ages, their own little place, that they kept the writing. And in fact, there's truth in this. They kept the Christian writing, so they were able to bring it back to the continent many centuries later and reintroduce some central Christian writing to the Christian community. Papal authority. As I said, Rome traced it to Peter. The first pope recognized by the Christian church for all of Christianity is uncertain. But at the Council of Chalcedon in 451, they seem to affirm papal leadership in the West. By the West, we're talking west of Greece. Now, about this time, the religious authorities felt the need for a better Bible, better Christian Bible. There were Bibles written in Latin, but they were considered to be quite inadequate, not very good translations, and often consisted only of some books of what we call the New Testament. And so the church commissions a scholar named Jerome, who lived from 347 to 420, to write a new Bible. Jerome is a great man, a great scholar. He spends the next 30 years becoming well-versed in reading and understanding Hebrew and Greek. And it's his life work to create this new Bible. And he finishes it just about 2 years before he dies. And it is, compared to what had been in existence before that, a much improved, by that I mean a more accurate translation of the original Hebrew that needs to be used in order to write a Bible. It would be called the Vulgate Bible, and it would be the Bible for Christianity for the next 1,000 years. It would be the only authorized Bible. And eventually, it would become the source of considerable friction within Christianity as people want to be able to read it for themselves in their own vernacular language. And as it began to be learned later on, that much of what was being preached from the pulpit and being claimed to be in the Bible wasn't even in the Bible. And so we'll get back to that later on. It was adopted slowly by the churches. Think of when the King James Bible was trying to be replaced by new and more accurate translations of the Bible. People resisted it. Some still do resist it. And so they were used to what they were used to. And so it took actually about 300 years before the whole Vulgate Bible became the Bible used by everyone. And what helped bring that about was the advent of kings in Europe who claimed divine right to rule, starting with Charlemagne. Charlemagne was in the years 741 to 814. He understood himself to be divine and that his authority came from God. And after that, most great rulers in the European countries all understand their kingship to be divine. And it was Charlemagne who required the adoption of the Vulgate Bible throughout his country, France, as well as other parts of Europe. Jerome himself did not see his translation as inspired, and in fact called it an interpretation, which in fact translations of Bibles are. Trying to understand the original language when it's a language that you've never known, and translating that can be quite hard. Jason and I were just out on a little walk the other day, and she was talking about idioms. It was on the word, what's the word thing that you get?
Oh, wordsmith.
Wordsmith, where a word is introduced that often we've never heard of and a definition given. And that there are idioms in our language that we use that would not translate. They simply wouldn't. You could not find in another language something that would mean something like fiddlesticks or what was gobbledygook. You know, we know what they mean. Well, there's words that were in Hebrew and Greek that translators for the Bible did not know what they meant. And so they just put in what they thought would be they meant. And sometimes it was not correct. Now we're moving on. I'm going to get part of this. The Middle Ages, the years 1000 to 1500. No. It first begins by a split in Christianity between the East and the West. And what comes out of that is Western Christianity is what we know as our form of Christianity, and Orthodox Christianity, Greek Orthodox, Russian Orthodox. There were growing strains between the Christian faith between the East and the West, and especially with the more and more power sitting with the Pope in Rome. And so on the on the date of July 16, 1054, the Patriarch of Constantinople, Michael Cerullius, was excommunicated by Pope Leo IX in Rome. Now, the Patriarch of Constantinople would immediately turn around and excommunicate Leo. And in a tit for tat move, and those mutual excommunications were not revoked until 1965. We know how enmity lasts a long time. And in the process, we've lost something. There is much in the Eastern Orthodox faith that is of rich and of great value. But because of the schism, we were not, I'm speaking of us in the West, were, not supposed to go there. And likewise, they were not supposed to go to us. The next significant Christian undertaking were the Crusades. And the first of those would start in 1096. They come about for several reasons. Pope Urban, don't remember if he had a number. Things were starting to unravel under his leadership, and he wanted to redirect people's attention to something else so that he could remain in power. And the the Jerusalem was under attack by Muslims and had been captured by Muslims. And this was a very big deal to Christians in the West. And it coincided at a time when there were knights, many young men who didn't have anything else to do. They were of the gentry, and they liked to joust, and they liked to fight. And so they took it upon themselves to create an army under the encouragement of the Pope, and they were given badges and various accoutrements. And there was also a large contingent of lay people led by Peter the Hermit, who simply thought this was the thing to do, and they took off with few possessions. Now we're talking about a 2,000-mile journey. And through multiple countries where they'd never been, through countries that were opposed to them coming through their land. And Peter the Hermit beat the knights in starting out first. Well, what happened was a tragic. As they went east, they killed thousands of Jews as somebody they could vent on before they ever got to the Holy Lands. And they were slaughters that went on during the whole Crusades. And they also ate up all the food through the area they went through because they had to have food. And that People's Crusade, it was called, would end in tragedy for them as well. They would never make it to the Holy Land. They would be confronted by the Seljuks in Turkey and destroyed, and nothing more was heard of them. But following on the heels of them came the knights under the kings. They made it to the Holy Land. They never did take Jerusalem, but they did manage to take other territories and start their own kingships there. So now we have European kings claiming territory in the Middle East and setting up their own kingships as their territory. That whole area would be called the Outremer. Don't know why, that's just a term for it.
And there were half a dozen different kings serving in the area who had their own territories. Now, that doesn't end the Crusades. There will be many more Crusades over the next 200 years with tremendous slaughter on both sides. Variety of reasons why they went on, oftentimes nothing related to do with faith. It's just a massive tragedy. I mean, I know it's romanticized. It wasn't in reality romantic. It was tremendous deaths on both sides. And in the end, nothing resolved. There were a number of famous people who would be involved. Pope Urban, Bernard of Clairvaux, who led the crusade preaching for the Second Crusade. He also composed the rules for the Knights Templar, which was a a military Christian organization that arose out of the Crusades. Eleanor of Aquitaine, who had been married to the King of France, went on the crusade with him. They decided they didn't want to be together. She would later marry Henry II, the King of England, and late in life was a very devoted Christian and did many good things of Christian charity. She was a fascinating individual. And there was Saladin, the leader of the Muslims. He was Kurdish by birth. He was the Sultan of Syria. He captured Jerusalem in 1187, which brought on the Third Crusade. Saladin was a very effective military leader. There was Richard the Lionhearted, who would become the King of England and fought against Saladin. Pope Innocent, whose preaching led to the Fourth and Fifth Crusades. There was a crusade that started out of Norway and made it to the Holy Land. It was a thing to do. And I don't want to belittle. These people were sincere in what they wanted to do. And there was great courage by many of the participants, which is often the case in war, that there's tremendous courage on individual basis, but the collective results were horrible. Hundreds of thousands of deaths. No advancement of religion by either side.
Also, Saladin, the Kurdish leader of the Muslims, when he took Jerusalem, he allowed the Christians to still live there and, and practice their faith, I believe. But they had a lot of restrictions. But when the Christians took it over and they just wiped all the Muslims out, they trashed their temples, and so there was just plenty of not good stuff to go around. Right? How many years are we talking about?
The Crusades went on from 1096 to about 1300, and they went at different periods of times. If you want a very good read about the Crusades, Dan Jones, who's a New York Times best-selling writer, this is from the library, I've read it, The Epic History of the Wars for the Holy Lands. It's very well done, very readable. He's also written about the kings of England, the Plantagenets, and the War of the Roses, and other parts of history. But as another way of being Christian, as in comparison to the Crusades, at the same time, you have Francis of Assisi, who takes an entirely different path than war. Many of you know some of the story, or maybe all of it. He was born to a wealthy merchant. He was described as an idle layabout and a master of revels in his young adulthood. He thought himself a knight. He went off to war amongst the city-states in Italy. He was imprisoned, ransomed. He came out of that with a period of very great internal distress that went on for several years. And then he had a vision and felt God was speaking to him. And he renounced his wealth in a very famous scene in which he stripped naked in the very fancy clothes he had on. His father would later sue him because of his behavior. He went then and lived a life of poverty, rebuilt a broken down church at San Damiano, gradually drew followers, that they would become the Franciscans. He was authorized at some point by the Pope for this order. He was in partner with Clare, a woman who had a nunnery, and between the two of them, they both lived a life of poverty. He believed in seeing all of life as God's creation. We know from the Canticles, including plants, animals, everything. In an interesting little sidebar, he took a trip to Egypt during the Fifth Crusade to try and bring about peace. Met with the Arab leader, tried to show him there was a better way, did try to convert him to Christianity. They parted peacefully. It didn't change the outcome of the crusade at that point in time. He begins to go blind in his 30s. And it's thought, in fact, that he writes the canticle as when he is blind, remembering all of those things that he describes as brother, sun, and sister moon. He dies at age 38. And I'd ask you the question, between the characters from the Crusades and Francis, who do we remember? Who has made a lasting impression on Christianity? A co-equal to Francis in Germany was a woman called Hildegard of Bingen. She was a devout Christian, the 10th child of a well-to-do family. She was offered by her parents to the church at age 8. This happens. So she was given over to the church. She was put with a woman named Jutta, who was an anchorite, which means they lived their life in a cell. The cell would have windows that opened onto the church so that they could hear the church services, and it had a window that they could speak with people who came up to that window for a faith, with faith questions that they had. Who is it in England that I like so much? Also an anchorite.
Oh, Julian.
Yeah, Julian of Norwich, same thing. They devoted themselves to that life. But then at a later age, she would leave that community and start her own religious community. And Hildegard would also have a vision. She called it her visions of greening. And she would go on to preach, heal. She discovered a number of medicines. She was a woman before her time. She wrote music.
That is still used.
That we still use, yes. She had times when she was at conflict with the Orthodox Church. But interestingly enough, in another connection with the Crusades, I mentioned Bernard of Clairvaux. Well, Bernard of Clairvaux defended Hildegard and said she should be allowed to go on and preach and minister as she was doing so. And she was beloved by her community. My time is up for that. We have made it to the 1100s and into the 1200s. And where we'll pick it up next week is the first movements to turn the Bible into common language vernaculars. And it will start, I'm not going to do it all, it starts in the 1100s with a small group called the Waldensians of northern Italy, who seek to, under the leadership of Petrus Waldes, seeks to turn the Latin into the common language of Italy, which was not Latin, so that people could read the Bible for themselves. And he's famous for the statement, Scripture is its own interpreter. So with that, I'm going to stop, and we'll pick it up again next week. And we will travel from 1100 to our current time, and then we'll have a chance. So this is who was the cartoon that had time travels? Rocky and Bullwinkle, wasn't it? You know, where you could move yourself magically from the 1100s to
Mr. Wizard.
Mr. Wizard. Oh,
I would just note that seminaries that, you know, empire focuses on church history.
yeah.
You have done a remarkable.
Well, you know, it feels quite broken and somewhat shallow. I've taught on all of these different things in the past, just on one of them. But underlying my reason for doing this is that if we're going to look at our place where we're at now with our faith and where it might go, we need to know what we come from. And what are the things that shine as models? What are the things that stand out as traps as we go forward? So just remember your belovedness, and we'll meet again next week.